So tonight we've got one of the events that's part of the program for National Lottery Heritage Foundation grant, which covers a number of themes, 4 themes, which you can read about on the Armenian Institute's website. And the event tonight is part of the literary heritage strand. So we were talking just before about how this was very much meant to be one of the in-person events, including ordering a special case for people to see the book that's being showcased, literally. But unfortunately, because of the situation, we can't do that. But with the magic of Zoom, we can still share and discuss, even if we can't see the book itself. So tonight, we're very lucky to have my colleague, Dr. Gagik Stepan-Sarkissian, taking us through the book that he's selected for us this month. Gagik is the librarian, research advisor, and head of language department here at the Armenian Institute, and also the Eastern Armenian teacher. He's a retired biochemist who's taught and led research groups in Tehran State University and the University of Sheffield before moving to the private sector, working in biotechnology and agribusiness across Europe. He also developed the first Armenian syllabus for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and taught there for several years. And one of the things that I've learned since joining in this last month is that Gagik knows absolutely everything. So we're very, very lucky to have him present tonight. And very much looking forward to what you've got to say. Gagik, Jan, please take it away.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Nick, for this very generous introduction. The event this evening, I'm going to, open my presentation. Right. The event this evening is on Books on Display, in the plural, a series of 23 volumes. Can you see this or not?
See which part?
The presentation, no?
No, you'll need to...
I have to share the screen. Sorry, yes, I forgot to do that. Apologies. Right, I think now you see it, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, that's much better. I can see you all as well. Right, the event this evening is on Books on Display, in the plural, a series of 23 volumes on Armenian architecture and stone art. But before I begin to talk about this series this evening, let me tell you about another book on display which marked me enormously. To do this, I'm going to invite you to accompany me to the Tehran of the 1960s, more specifically to a short street in the center of the Iranian capital. For me, the story of this series starts with this street. This is the street, a contemporary picture of the 1950s. The street sign gave the name of this thoroughfare in Persian and French, Avenue du Généralissime Staline. In its short stretch, around 250 meters, the street housed the Soviet Information Bureau, the Zoroastrian Temple, and the Zoroastrian High School for Boys. On the opposite side, we had the Armenian Cathedral of Holy Mother of God, and next to it, the Armenian High School for Boys. The street ended in a T-junction joining Churchill Avenue, right opposite the main gate of the vast Soviet embassy compound. You have now correctly guessed that this urban nomenclature in the capital of Imperial Iran was commemorating the Tehran Conference of 1943. Facing the Soviet embassy gate over here, there was a little stall selling soft drinks ostensibly selling soft drinks, but actually it was there for surveillance purposes. And there was another one here at the bottom of the street doing the same thing with the opposite the Soviet Information Bureau. You can actually see here the one at the southern end of the street, the little stall. But we will only cast a cursory glance at these landmarks and head towards a bookshop right after the Zoroastrian temple, this one. The bookshop was the preeminent Armenian bookstore in the city and was named after its owner, Sako Hovsepian. That's him in this grainy photograph I managed to find on the internet. The bookshop mainly Soviet publications as well as Russian books from the Soviet Union. The shop window was populated with dusty hardback books with serious-looking embossed covers in dark colors. In my late teens, I was a frequent visitor and occasional customer. I was used to the drab appearance of the shop window and had stopped noticing its very uninviting appearance. Then one day, as I approached the shop, I saw this book in the shop window, a striking color photograph of an Armenian church on shiny cover. Like a ray of sunshine, an unfamiliar burst of color through the gloom of the other covers. For me, on that day, this was the book on display par excellence. The first issue of this series, Documents of Armenian Architecture, was on the monastery of Harbad in Soviet Armenia. It wasn't just the spectacular photograph on the shiny cover that made the publication and its successor volumes stand out. The series was the result of a rare but major cooperation. We are now talking about the late 1960s, the Brezhnev era, between a Western university institution, in this case, the Faculty of Architecture of Milan Polytechnic, and a Soviet academic institution, Academy of Sciences of Soviet Armenia. The stimulus that gave rise to this rare cooperation was a series of meetings between groups of Italian and Armenian scholars and architects based at the Polytechnic in Milan. They organized a series of research missions in Soviet Armenia, Turkey, and Iran to study selected monuments of Armenian architecture. The nucleus of these groups consisted of Professor Adriano Alpago Novello, engineer Armen Manukyan, and the architect Herman Vahramian. Their point of contact in Yerevan was architect Armen Zaryan, who together with his father, the famous author Kostan Zaryan, had moved recently from Rome to Yerevan. I think it was in 1963. In the first issue, the publishers laid out clearly the reason for their endeavor. They recognized that the Armenian art had hitherto been superficially considered as a peripheral area of the Byzantine world and only studied in general terms without recourse to on-site documentation. In setting out to publish this series, its initiators' aim was to present for the first time a collection of Armenian architectural movements. The series was to supply for each monument an exhaustive, in most cases previously unpublished, photographic record and also complete surveys, accompanied by short historical, investigative, and illustrative essays by scholars from Armenia and Italy. The first issue came out in 1968, and the last one, volume 23, in 1998. So we are talking about 30 years encompassing the publication of these 23 volumes. Except for the second issue, which dealt with a particular theme, the Armenian crossstones or khachkars, the rest of the volumes, which were surveyed individual churches, monasteries, and also selected regions. More than half the volumes, 14 in all, were devoted to monuments in the territory of the Armenian Republic. 4 issues surveyed Armenian monasteries in Iran. There was the monastery of St. Thaddeus, then the monastery of St. Stephen near the Araxes River. Then a volume was devoted to the churches and also some manorial houses of New Julfa. And the last one dealt with churches and chapels in northwestern Iran. In addition to all these volumes, there were 2 volumes that dealt with monuments in Turkey, the Church of Holy Cross on the island of Akhtamar in Lake Van, and also the ruined city of Ani. Then finally, there were 2 issues which were devoted to Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. The first one, volume 17, came out in June 1987 on the monastery of Gandzasar in Artsakh. But the following year, in October, barely 8 months after the start of the Karabakh movement, the publishers were able to put together another volume on the rest of the architectural monuments in Karabakh. They were very quick to follow the events in 1988. This particular volume on Karabakh not only discussed the religious architecture of the region, but also dealt with bridges and mansions of the erstwhile feudal chiefs, the Meliks of Karabakh. And interestingly, devoted a whole chapter to rural architecture, a rare thing in the entire series. How were these volumes organized? As an example, I have chosen volume number 9 on the Church of Yereruk in northwestern Armenia, in the region of Shirak. The architecture of this basilica-type spacious church is unique amongst surviving examples of early Armenian churches. Dating from the 5th century to the early 6th, it has some features in common with other early Armenian churches, but its twin towered facade is reminiscent of similar churches, early churches in northern Syria, like those in Kalblauza and Turmanin. The book on Yereruk begins with its architectural description by 2 specialists. It has a map which shows where in Armenia is, sorry, Yereruk, and also a general view picture just to show us what the ruin looks like in its entirety. There follows a series of quite spectacular images of architectural details and sculptural decorations, almost like a photographic essay. Certain black and white photographs are included to demonstrate the damages done to the building by time and man. The book then concludes with detailed surveys showing a very detailed plan of the building and also elevations, sections, and sometimes comparative plans. From the very beginning, the series was bilingual in Italian and English, the former in large and the latter in small font. However, in later issues, as the publication became almost global with the States, the trend was reversed, with the Italian appearing in smaller font. West Armenian translations of text start appearing from volume 5 onwards. But what are the merits of this series? Up until the first quarter of the 20th century, the heritage of medieval Armenian architecture was largely unrecognized by Western scholars. The available information consisted largely of accounts and descriptions by European travelers, some of whom also provided approximate plans and general views of some monuments. One of the first European scholars who came up with a serious study of Armenian architecture was the Polish-Austrian art historian Józef Strzykowski, who published his Architecture of the Armenians and Europe in 1918 and gave rise amongst historians of art and architecture to a lively polemical discussion in which the Armenian architecture often occupied center stage. Lack of access to Armenian monuments in their original setting in Republican Turkey and Soviet Armenia put a stop to further studies for at least half a century, until the emergence of the Italian pioneers in Milan and also in Rome, because there was also a team in Rome working on Armenian architecture, and this team was led by Paolo Cuneo. Their work, as manifested in the series under discussion here, played a significant role in reviving scholarly interest in the Armenian architecture. The principal objective of the Italian teams was not to produce a comparative study of Armenian architecture, thus skirting around controversial issues. For example, they didn't discuss whether the Georgians or the Armenians came up with the dome structure. They avoided issues like that. They concentrated, however, on producing documentation and cataloging the existing heritage and putting forward preservation plans and exploring local architectural traditions. This serial publication brought together major scholars of Armenian studies working in the Soviet Armenia and the diaspora, and made available in Western languages the important work of Soviet Armenian art and architectural historians, hitherto only available in either Armenian or Russian. So their work became available to art historians in Western Europe and North America. The photographic evidence and the detailed survey records assembled during various research missions in Armenia and neighboring countries led not only to the publication of documents of Armenian architecture, which some would argue was intended for the general public, but resulted in the proliferation of hefty monographs and meticulously researched articles of scholarly character on Armenian art and architecture. Other important spin-offs were a series of international symposia dedicated to Armenian art and an itinerant exhibition on Armenian architecture, which toured Italy and abroad. The work of these Italian pioneers had other merits too. It resulted in the discovery of monuments, particularly in Turkey, where European teams had better access to Armenian sites without rousing the suspicion of the authorities. A case in point is the Church of Holy Echmiadzin in the village of Soradir in eastern Turkey, very near the Iranian border. The church stands on a low hill and can be seen from a great distance on account of its characteristic volume and the massive, lofty drum surmounting it. It's very unusual to see something like that in an Armenian church. Until an Italian mission discovered the church in the 1960s, the Church of Soradir was not mentioned in critical works on Armenian architecture, since it was quite unknown to modern and contemporary scholars. In the absence of any written records about the church, the Italians dated the church to the 6th century, based on its archaic ornamental themes and also the stone cutting. The dome of this church, as you see, is particularly interesting because it is square in shape with rounded corners. Other examples of domes built to such a shape are unknown in Armenia. Tommaso Fratadocchi, who produced a monograph on this church, concludes that although the builder did not lack the technical skill necessary for the erection of a circular dome, he perhaps wanted to introduce and to experiment with this square type of dome. Continuing the narrative of discovery, I should also mention the volume dedicated to Armenian churches and chapels in northwestern Iran. These two maps show the extent of Armenian church distribution in the Iranian province of Azerbaijan in northwestern Iran. So this one is a magnified area around to the west of Lake Urmia. So you can see the number of villages and the churches which existed in these places. The volume also contains a table which lists nearly 100 churches and chapels in this part of Iran only. Of course, this was not a discovery like that of the church in Soradir. After all, when the Italians visited this area, there were still Armenians living and farming in a few of these villages, and their churches were known and used for worship. These churches were mentioned in memoirs and travelers' reports, and some even containing photographs. However, apart from the major monastery of St. Thaddeus and St. Stephen, which we saw earlier, none of the other churches had been systematically surveyed and detailed photographic evidence gathered for publication. During several missions in the 1970s, a series of important, previously unknown evidence of Armenian presence was also identified and documented in the region. Professor Christina Maranci, a recent guest speaker at one of Armenian Institute's events on Artsakh, has written extensively about Armenian art and architecture. In her work, she has explored questions such as, how does the idea of an Armenian church emerge? Indeed, certain characteristics and styles have come to be identified as traditional Armenian church, as a traditional Armenian church. Most Armenians and non-Armenians thinking about an Armenian church would visualize a domed, well, this shouldn't have been here, but still, a domed stone-built structure, like the church of Saint Repsime, 7th century in Armenia, the church of Holy Cross in Akhtamar, 10th century, but also a 20th century church, St. Vartan in New York. They sort of mimic each other in style. However, any building, regardless of its style and building material, that fulfills the liturgical needs of the Armenian church is a sort of valid Armenian church. This series, the Italian series on Armenian architecture, emphasized this point by presenting to the reader not only the classic Armenian architecture, but also buildings which different in style, like Yereruk, which didn't look like any other church, and also in construction material, like this church, again in northwestern Iran, built entirely of brick, and again another church in the same region, built of a local construction material consisting of mixture of straw and clay. And the next picture shows the interior of such a rustic rural church in that region. To use a cliche for want of a better phrase, it is difficult to overestimate the role of this series in putting the Armenian architecture on the map. I hope I have been able to convey this in the course of this talk. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Gagik, for giving us such a broad overview of this seminal series. I know the Ani one very well from my own research, and they remain essential for researchers. There are many of these churches that haven't been documented since. That this is the sole time that they've been given this kind of treatment. So, as I said in the chat and at the beginning, we're now open for a question and answers session. So if you have a question, please either post it into the chat yourself or use the raise hand function. But maybe just while people are letting things settle and thinking about what they'd like to ask, I'll use the chair's privilege, if I may, and ask about these rural churches. Because as you mentioned, that's a really understudied context for Armenian architecture. There's often either monasteries in splendid isolation or urban settings. And it's also a setting that's less researched in terms of pre-modern Armenian history. The focus is often on royal or feudal elites or on merchants. So it's really fascinating to hear more about these rural structures, and especially with living peasant agrarian communities still around them as well. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about those volumes and what they say about life there.
Well, I think in particular, outside Armenia, apart from Syria, perhaps, and Georgia, Iran was the other country where there were Armenian villages, not only in northwestern Iran, but also in central Iran. And these villages, depending on the wealth of the inhabitants, built their own churches, sometimes very minute, very small, mostly of wood and this mixture of clay and straw. Very rarely of stone, and these were the older ones. And sometimes on one or two cases in brick, which is unusual for an Armenian church. The villages did not follow a certain pattern. They did what they could. So they were not constrained by the so-called classic Armenian architecture. The trend that we now see happening in villages in Armenia, where well-to-do former people from villages return to the village and build a church in a very classic style in stone. Whereas perhaps if left to the people living in the village, they would have come up with a different thing. So I think in that part of northwestern Iran, in the villages, as far as I know, there are no more Armenians living. So the record that the Italians produced tells us what existed there before, because if you have no one looking after a church or any building, really, it's going to be dilapidated and will eventually fall into ruin. And I think this has happened I know of at least 3 or 4 villages where I had seen the existing churches, and now they're just a rubble, really.
Oh, that's really sad, but it does really drive home one of the major values of this series, which is the preservation of so much at-risk heritage. We have another comment in the chat pointing out that as you noted, this square cubical dome, it's a real gem. and this friend also doesn't accept the idea that it was hindered by technology and that otherwise they would have gone for this more normative or what we expect an Armenian church to look like.
Actually, sorry, Nick, the author Tommaso Fratadocchi says that because it's a very thorough survey of the church, and in his book he says actually it would have been easier for the builder to build a circular dome than construct this unusual shape based on the load-bearing walls. Interesting.
Oh, very interesting, and it sort of drives home. We often because we only see the architecture now, we forget that there were architects,
yes,
who wanted to innovate and wanted to explore.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat now. One is asking if there's 21 volumes in total then?
23.
23.
23. It ended with Vagar Shapat, the churches of Echmiadzin and the surrounding chapels.
And another friend, Avo Ghazal, has said, I wonder if you have visited the Akhtamar church in Van, which has now been restored. Do you think that it's been restored in a way that's faithful to the original condition? And a big question here, should church monuments be restored or should they be kept as they currently are?
Well, three questions, I think. First of all, I haven't visited the Church of Akhtamar, although I have crossed Turkey overland 3 times, but at that time, Lake Van and the surrounding area was considered to be a militarized zone, and foreigners were not allowed to travel to that part. So I haven't seen the church, unfortunately. I would have seen it if I had seen it before the restoration. I don't know how the restoration was carried out. A few years ago, we had the Armenian architect who was involved with the restoration of the church, who gave us a talk about the restoration. I think if a church or any building is restored now, if they can get hold of the original material, fine, but otherwise they should make clear what is the original material and what is added new. I think this is what they did at Garni in Armenia. When you visit the temple, there are bits of stone which are not carved, just to show that they have been put there as new material. Of course, this is something, it's a 20th, 21st century concept, not to, in the past, when a church fell into ruin, they just restored it the way they liked it. They liked to restore this. They had no concerns about that. Yeah. But now we have to formulate a sort of attitude or approach to this. So I don't know whether we have reached a final decision on that.
Yes, and I think it's very interesting that, well, not only do these so many restorations mean that you leave lots of fun clues for scholars, but also in choosing one form, it means you're choosing one period of a building that might have a millennium of history.
Exactly.
But yeah. I can say in response to Avo, I've been to Akhtamar 4 years ago now. And as restorations go, it feels minimal. It's preserving what's there, and it's not. It didn't seem to add on too much on top of that. There's potentially a lot of the archaeological context around the church is more what's been lost. But certainly by standards of some other restorations, which we won't mention, it does seem more tastefully done. Some more questions. Stephen asks whether we have all 23 in the library.
Sadly, we don't. We are missing the final, I think, 3 volumes. So to prepare this talk, I had to rely on my own collection, which thankfully is complete. I think I remember spending all my pocket money for that month on that single volume number 1 on Hachbad. But if anyone has extra copies of volumes 20, 21, 22, and 23, we would welcome the donation, and we'll stick a book plate inside with your name on.
And something that I do know we have is a few duplicates of some of the other volumes, which
Yes, we do.
are for sale.
Yes, yes, and they are for sale if you're interested. But these are the earlier volumes, duplicates.
And John Stambolian asks, to what extent has earthquake resistance determined the form of Armenian architecture?
I can't answer a question like that. You need an engineer and an architectural, structural architect, I think, to answer a question like that. But of course, you do hear urban legends about the way they constructed all the lightening material, the amphora they put in the upper part of the domes to lighten the weight on the circular dome. But I'm not qualified to answer a question like that.
And Aram Muradjan asks, are there specific architects that we know of? Are we able to make links between churches in terms of authorship?
Yes, very few, very few. Hello, Aram. I can't see you, but I know you are there. I think we have, I can think of two names, Momik and Tertad. I think Tertad was involved in the construction of the cathedral in Ani.
Yes.
And legend has it that he also traveled to Constantinople to restore the dome of the Church of Holy Wisdom. So, yeah. But Tertad and Momik are two architects that we know of. I don't think we know the name of the architect of Zvartnots, but we have the name of a stone cutter called Hovnan in Zvartnots, because the name was found on one of the stones in the ruins. But very few architects from medieval times are known.
Yeah, in terms of authorship, one thing that we can do, of course, is tell particular schools. So even if we can't see the architects themselves, for example, the famous Ani school, it's clear that then there were workmen and architects going to Marmashen,
yes,
Republic and things like that.
Yeah, that's very true. Mm.
So Nicole Bellamy asks, what's the legacy of these publications? Does the exhibition still exist and tour? Or are there architects or architectural historians who continue to investigate off the basis of these this series?
They do. As you know, they stopped publishing after 1998. But the work continues, and every now and then I come across not only Italian names that continue this work, but also work that is being done in Western European and American universities. As I mentioned earlier, it wasn't just this sort of popular series that everyone could buy and go through and just look at the pictures and the elevations and possibly even read the texts. But all these people who were involved in the production of these volumes also produced a great number of monographs that were understandable only by architectural historians and engineers about the structural specifics of these buildings. So the work does continue. Alpago Novello, who was the initiator of the entire project together with some Armenians in Milan, he also created a center for the study of Armenian culture and heritage, or something like that, in Milan. They also started working or did some work on Armenian music, but I don't know if this center is still operational. But the Polytechnic of Milan, as far as I know, is not involved in any great extent in the continuation of this endeavor. But they have sort of sown the seeds of making Armenian architecture available, accessible in Western languages. And I think this is their main legacy that continues to this day. Also, I think one additional merit of this work was that when they were commissioning articles from Soviet Armenian historians and architects, I think they were careful to mention to them, perhaps very gently, that they should steer away from a nationalistic thesis in presenting their work. So in a way that created another school in Armenia, that this is how you should approach an academic question. You should leave aside national feelings or susceptibilities and write about the topic itself.
Very interesting. And on what you've been saying before about the Milan Polytechnic, Rafi Kirkian says in the chat that he just want to mention that the Faculty of Architecture at the Milan Polytechnic also published another collection about Armenian architecture, yes, under the direction of Adriano Alpago Novello, and 17 and 18 are dedicated to the Armenian Church in Iran.
Yes. I have some of them, actually, some of these monographs.
So I just look down. So Nuritsa says, thank you, Gagik, for this marvelous and personal overview of a prize series. I've visited some erstwhile Armenian villages, as you described, near Isfahan, and noticed that there was a strong affinity between the churches and the houses in those villages, both building materials and architecture. And also noticed that in Isfahan, the churchyards often had a shrine which opened outdoors. This seems to be a specific feature of the Isfahan area. So could you comment a little further on that?
I've visited New Julfa and Isfahan as a tourist, and I do remember these shrines, but I don't know the reason for these and why it came about in Isfahan and perhaps nowhere else. But it's true that in villages, sometimes churches were built like big houses. It was just a bigger hall, but it was constructed in exactly the same way as a house. So we have in some of these villages, we have the dome like Hazarashen. I don't know how to explain that in English, but it's a series of planks put one after the other until they got narrow at the end with a hole for aeration, I suppose, ventilation. But this is, as Nuritsa mentioned, this is something which also needs investigating, where did the practice originated from and why. Everything has a reason.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It reminds me of these churches that you get in Crete, which are also single halls in rural communities, and sometimes you have the lists of the people who paid for them as well, which is a good way to try and explain some materials. And they seem like very humble people. And actually, one question I had, since we're on these rural churches again, is to what extent there's internal decorations in there, because these ones in Crete, they often the structure is very simple, but painting or icons or other features are quite rich.
Well, as you know, Armenian churches are generally devoid of internal decoration. I think you just sometimes in the more significant churches, you see stone work or stone reliefs on the walls, but very rarely we see paintings. We see frescoes in churches in northern Armenia, which were, I think, previously Chalcedonian. And the same thing happens in Ani. The churches which were built after the 11th century, you see these frescoes because the Zakarians who paid for some of them, they were of a Chalcedonian persuasion. But generally in rural churches, especially in Iran, you don't have any decorations on the walls, but you have shrines next to the altar where people would bring printed sacred images, some textiles and things like that, and lamps, and they would put their in a sort of hodgepodge manner. That's the only decoration you would see in a church like that. But otherwise, it was they were all very plain, and not even plastered. Some of them.
Wow, that's So it's really just for the community to worship.
Yes.
So another one of the big questions from Nikola Novcic. To what extent does the current geopolitical tension between Turkey and Armenia influence the way and the extent to which Turkish-backed restoration programs approach Armenian heritage? And a sort of sub-question to this, does this then influence the period that's chosen as the one that gets restored?
I don't know much about what Turkey is doing in restoring Armenian churches. I mean, apart from the obvious example of Akhtamar, I have seen pictures of restorations in Ani. I'm not an expert, but I don't think they are the right type of restoration. So I really cannot comment on that, and whether or not there is an ultimate aim in doing restorations like that, I don't know. I haven't read enough about this.
I think one interesting example that Nicola could look into is the Surpgiragos Church in
oh yes, in Diyarbakir,
which where the restoration was actually politicized, sort of against the prevailing Turkish regime, so by the HDP mayor, and I think the response to that is quite instructive.
Yeah. You're right.
And Bella Radenovic asks, many of these volumes were co-authored, and in some cases Armenian scholars were paired up with Italian or French scholars.
Sure.
So she wonders if we know anything about the collaborative process involved in the production of the series. How does this approach to writing about Armenian architecture compare to the more common single author and at times nationalist histories of Armenian art?
Well, I think this was one of the merits of this series in bringing together Armenian historians and architects and archaeologists who had hitherto been accessible in only Armenian and Russian. And they were able to, first of all, the Italian teams located these people in Armenia, commissioned these articles, and brought them together with some diaspora scholars and Italians who had been members of the mission. I think, as I say, it's one of the merits of this collaboration between Armenians, diaspora Armenians, and also Italian researchers.
Nuritsa has pointed out that in New Julfa, of course, the churches there do have very rich internal decorations, a riot of painting and color. But Aram asks a second question, and maybe one for you to daydream, Gagik, about some future volumes, an area for the AI to continue expanding into. To what extent is this series comprehensive? What is missing? And if you were to expand the series, what would you include?
That's a very interesting question. I would perhaps include some of the Armenian churches in Georgia, which I think the Italian mission, perhaps for political reasons, did not touch. Some of the major monastic complexes, like, for example, Dadivan, who has been in the news recently, was not included, or it appeared briefly in the Qarabağ volume, but there wasn't a single volume dedicated to it. Possibly also Zvartnots and Zvartnots type churches, which exist in northeastern Turkey, in Banag, for example. And also the smaller example of it in Ani, the Gakashen subrecord. So the field is very wide, and it won't be difficult to choose what to include. I think also the cathedral at Mren, again in Turkey, is a very important example of Armenian architecture. Another one which is no longer, which is in complete ruin now, the cathedral or the church in Tekor, which had an exact square drum before the conical top of the dome. Things like that, I think, will shed a lot of light on the Armenian architectural heritage and the variations of it. So we don't look at it as a monolith, that this is an Armenian church should look like that. So there are many variations and a continuation of the series. I was very, very disappointed when they stopped at volume 23. I think they could have gone up to 100 very easily.
Yes, absolutely. So there aren't more questions, but I would invite friends to keep putting their questions in the chat or hands if they wish to ask themselves. But that last question on what isn't there, sort of maybe it'd be useful to ask another question on what is there and what this really represents, because you said in your talk that you couldn't really overestimate the importance of this series. Are there projects that you know of where you can point directly to the influence, or churches that you've mentioned that now no longer exist?
I think as far as the continuation of their work, I don't think the work is continuing directly under the auspices of the Milan Polytechnic, but I did mention a few spin-offs, and one of them which I did not mention is this association in Yerevan called Research in Armenian Architecture, RAA, which has done similar work to the Italian work. They have published many volumes from the mid-1990s onwards, very detailed surveys of monuments, not only in Armenia itself, but also in Artsakh. So work continues not by through the originators, the initiators of the project, but it has given an idea to other people who have continued. And there was a second part to this question. What was that? Sorry.
The second part was just to to underline some of the importance of these as documents for monuments that we now no longer have. So if there are some examples that you have to mind of particularly important documentation for monuments that are now gone or inaccessible.
I think not that monuments have gone, but they have considerably, some of them have considerably deteriorated since the publication of this work. I think one point in example is Yereruk itself. It's not as the Italian missions saw it in 1965-66. The same goes with the village churches in northwest Iran. Some of them, the only record we have is the photographic evidence, surveys, and the plans that the Italians prepared. And the rest, if you go there now, you will just see rubble.
Yeah. Well, I think we don't have more questions coming into the chat. So although I could keep asking questions and we could keep coming up with more examples all night, we might let our friends get on with their evenings. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming. So we have one question from Nicole Bellamy. Do any of the Armenian churches have UNESCO World Heritage status? And most importantly, he wants to thank you for sharing your own story of being drawn to these books for their graphic quality among their drab neighbours, which I also really enjoyed, having been to some second-hand bookstores in Armenia and Georgia. And would you be prepared to be interviewed for the blog Bookstokers? A proposition as well.
Well, if you think I have something interesting to say, why not?
Great. Well, I could see our director there giving the thumbs up, so I think you might have been asked to go, even if not.
But I think concerning the UNESCO registration, I don't know what it's called really, but there are some churches, for example, Echmiadzin in Armenia is on that list, but also through the auspices of the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, many of the monasteries and churches in Iran have been registered in that roster. So yes, quite a few of them occur on UNESCO heritage as UNESCO heritage site.
Yes, and Aram asks that whether Ani is UNESCO, but I understand it's not. It's on the list.
I don't know.
It's on the list, but it's a bit of a
yeah,
tortured issue, and that's one of the things that Osman Cavallo, of course, who we platformed in our event about the commemoration for Hrant Dink, was very involved in trying to finally get going. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you for all your questions and all your comments, and of course, most especially, thank you to Gagik Can Shajnorakaluchun. And there's just a feedback form in the chat. Please, if you enjoyed or thought that there were things that we could do better, or any other feedback that you would have, please leave that for us. And enjoy your evenings. Barikisher.
Barikisher. Thank you very much. Good night.